The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of Courtroom 302 in the Milwaukee County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Superior Court Judge Richard Bennett adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the day's docket, his fingertips drumming against the ancient oak of his bench. 23 years on the bench had earned him a reputation for running his courtroom with military precision and unwavering strictness. The Monday morning traffic court proceeded with its usual efficiency. A parade of speeders, red light runners, and parking violators shuffled through, each receiving Bennett's trademark stern lectures and predictable fines. His clerk, Marion Reynolds, had long since memorized his patterns, the slight tilt of his head when he was skeptical, the way he pushed his glasses up his nose before delivering particularly harsh sentences. At precisely 10:45 a.m., Dr. Sophia Washington entered the courtroom. She moved with quiet confidence, her charcoal gray suit pristine, her natural hair styled professionally. Unlike the nervous energy radiating from most defendants, she carried herself with remarkable poise. Taking her seat in the third row, she pulled out a small leather notebook and began reviewing her notes. Judge Bennett barely glanced up as her case was called. Case number 2024-TR-1542, City of Milwaukee versus Washington. Alleged violation of Municipal Traffic Code Section 346.57. His voice carried the same weary monotone he'd used for the previous dozen cases. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Washington approached the podium. The gallery had thinned considerably since the morning rush, leaving only a handful of observers, two law students furiously taking notes, an elderly man waiting for his grandson's case, and a court reporter who'd seen thousands of these proceedings. None of them could have predicted how this seemingly routine traffic stop was about to unfold. Bennett shuffled through the citation papers, his reading glasses perched at the tip of his nose. Ms. Washington, you were observed traveling 47 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone on Bradford Avenue. He peered over his glasses with the practiced disapproval he perfected over 2 decades. Do you understand the serious nature of this violation? The corner of Dr. Washington's mouth twitched slightly, but she maintained her composure. The room temperature seemed to drop a few degrees as Bennett continued his pre-fine lecture, his voice taking on the condescending tone he often reserved for what he considered to be particularly egregious violations. Marion Reynolds, watching from her desk, noticed something different about this defendant. Most people wilted under Bennett's stern gaze, but Dr. Washington stood straight, her expression neutral but quietly assured. She held her folder with steady hands, waiting for the judge to finish his speech. The morning light had shifted, creating a golden rectangle on the courtroom floor between the judge's bench and where Dr. Washington stood. The old radiators clanked in the background, a familiar soundtrack to the daily proceedings. But there was an unusual tension building in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that even the drowsy law students seemed to notice, straightening in their seats. Judge Bennett reached for his gavel, ready to pronounce the fine that would teach another speeder a lesson in respecting traffic laws. He had no idea that in the next few moments, his entire day, and perhaps his approach to his job, would undergo a dramatic transformation. The morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air as Judge Bennett leaned forward, his chair creaking under the shift in weight. Ms. Washington, your driving record shows 2 previous warnings for similar violations in the past 3 years. He paused for effect, a technique he perfected over countless cases. This pattern suggests a disturbing disregard for public safety. Dr. Washington stood motionless at the podium, her leather portfolio resting against its edge. She'd spent 20 years in various courtrooms across the country, though usually on the other side of the bench. The irony of her current position wasn't lost on her, but years of judicial experience had taught her the value of patience and timing. A young law clerk scurried into the courtroom, delivering a stack of files to Marion Reynolds. The sound of shuffling papers provided a brief interruption to Bennett's mounting lecture. Through the tall windows, clouds drifted past, temporarily dimming the natural light that had been streaming into the courtroom. In this jurisdiction, Bennett continued, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority, we take traffic violations very seriously. He removed his glasses, polishing them with a microfiber cloth. Another of his theatrical courtroom gestures. Perhaps in your neighborhood, speeding is considered acceptable, but here. The air in the courtroom grew noticeably thicker. Marion Reynolds, who had served as Bennett's clerk for over a decade, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. In all her years, she had never heard him come quite so close to crossing the line with his remarks. The 2 law students in the gallery exchanged uneasy glances, their pens hovering motionless above their notepads. Dr. Washington's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her portfolio, the leather creasing softly under her grip. 20 years on the federal bench had given her an intimate understanding of justice, fairness, and the subtle ways prejudice could seep into judicial proceedings. She'd witnessed countless examples of unconscious bias, had written numerous opinions addressing systemic inequities, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The elderly man in the gallery cleared his throat, drawing a sharp glance from Judge Bennett, who didn't appreciate interruptions during his lectures. The sound of traffic filtered in from Bradford Avenue outside, a fitting backdrop to this particular case. A siren wailed in the distance, its pitch rising and falling like the tension in the room. Furthermore, Bennett pressed on, shuffling through her file with barely concealed disdain. Your attitude during the traffic stop was noted as uncooperative by the officer. He looked up, expecting to see the usual signs of intimidation he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he found himself meeting a steady, dignified gaze that somehow made him feel like he was the one being evaluated. The wall clock ticked steadily toward 11, its sound seemingly amplified in the charged atmosphere. Marion Reynolds watched Dr. Washington carefully, noting how she maintained perfect posture, how her expression remained professional despite the judge's increasingly contentious tone. There was something about her demeanor that suggested this story was far from over. Just as Bennett reached for his gavel, preparing to pronounce what would undoubtedly be an excessive fine, Dr. Washington finally moved to open her portfolio. The simple action carried such quiet authority that even the judge paused mid-motion, though he didn't yet understand why. Judge Bennett's voice cut through the courthouse air like a dull blade. Given your record and the severity of this violation, I'm setting the fine at $500. He delivered the amount with the satisfaction that made Marion Reynolds wince internally. The fine was more than triple the standard penalty, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The radiator pipes clanked again, a metallic protest that seemed to echo the unspoken tension. Dr. Washington remained still, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the judge's mounting self-importance. She noticed a young court officer near the door shift his weight uncomfortably, clearly aware of the disparity in the judge's ruling. Through the tall windows, the late morning sun had reached its full strength, casting harsh shadows across Bennett's bench. The light caught his wedding ring as he raised his hand to adjust his glasses, creating a brief flash that drew attention to the gesture's theatrical nature. He'd developed these movements over years, each one calculated to reinforce his authority. Furthermore, he continued, warming to his theme, I'm requiring attendance at a defensive driving course. He shuffled through his papers with exaggerated importance, the sound sharp in the hushed courtroom. Perhaps this will help you understand the importance of following our traffic laws. The two law students in the gallery had stopped taking notes entirely, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and fascination. One leaned over to whisper to the other, only to be silenced by Bennett's sharp glare. The elderly man who had been waiting for his grandson's case now sat forward, his weathered hands gripping his cane tighter, sensing the injustice unfolding before him. Marion Reynolds watched as Dr. Washington finally opened her portfolio, revealing a neat stack of documents. The clerk had seen thousands of defendants in this courtroom, but something about this woman's deliberate movement suggested a storm gathering beneath her calm exterior. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their steady hum a counterpoint to the mounting tension. A police officer entering for the next case paused in the doorway, picking up on the charged atmosphere. Even with his years of experience reading rooms, he couldn't quite identify the source of the peculiar energy, but he knew something was different about this proceeding. Judge Bennett, oblivious to the subtle shifts in his courtroom's dynamics, pressed on. The defensive driving course must be completed within 30 days, with proof submitted to this court. He emphasized each requirement with a slight tap of his pen against the bench, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. Dr. Washington squared her shoulders, the movement so subtle it was almost imperceptible. Her fingers moved to the top document in her portfolio, the paper carrying what appeared to be an official seal. The morning light caught the embossed marking, creating a brief glimmer that drew attention to the federal watermark. The wall clock's ticking seemed to grow louder in the momentary silence, marking the seconds before what would become a defining moment in Judge Bennett's career. Marion Reynolds found herself holding her breath, recognizing the calm before what promised to be a significant storm. She'd seen enough courtroom drama to know when the script was about to change dramatically. Just as Bennett began to reach for his gavel to finalize his ruling, Dr. Washington cleared her throat softly, the small sound carrying an authority that made everyone in the room, except the still oblivious judge, sit up straighter. Your Honor, Dr. Washington began, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades on the federal bench. Before you finalize your ruling, I believe I should introduce myself properly. She withdrew a credential wallet from her portfolio, the leather soft from years of use. The federal eagle embossed on its surface caught the late morning light. Judge Bennett barely glanced up, his hand still poised over his gavel. Ms. Washington, I've already heard quite enough. The words died in his throat as she continued speaking, her tone measured and clear. I am Federal Appeals Court Judge Dr. Sophia Washington of the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. Each word fell into the courtroom like a stone into still water, creating ripples of reaction. Your court falls within my jurisdiction of review. The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and profound. Marion Reynolds dropped her pen, the plastic clatter against her desk sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. The law students in the gallery sat up so straight their backs barely touched their chairs, frantically scribbling this unexpected turn of events. Bennett's face went through a remarkable series of transitions, from dismissive authority to confusion, then to dawning recognition, and finally settling into a mask of barely concealed mortification. The blood drained from his face so quickly that his normally ruddy complexion turned nearly gray. I have here, Dr. Washington continued, drawing out a document with deliberate grace, my credentials and bar certification, though I suspect a simple online search would confirm my identity. She placed the documents on the podium with practiced precision, the federal seals clearly visible from Bennett's bench. The young court officer by the door had pushed himself away from the wall, standing at attention almost unconsciously. Even the elderly man in the gallery seemed to sit taller, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched justice take an unexpected turn. Through the windows, a cloud passed over the sun, temporarily dimming the courtroom. In that brief moment of shadow, Judge Bennett seemed to physically shrink behind his bench. His wire-rimmed glasses slipped down his nose, but for once, he didn't immediately push them back up. Bennett started and stopped, his usual eloquence deserting him. The hand that had been so ready with the gavel now lay flat on his desk, fingers splayed as if to steady himself. The courtroom's air conditioning hummed in the background, the only sound breaking the thick silence. Dr. Washington stood perfectly still, her posture a masterclass in judicial bearing. She spent years teaching seminars on courtroom conduct and implicit bias to other judges, but she hadn't planned on delivering such a pointed lesson today. The irony wasn't lost on her, but her expression revealed nothing except professional courtesy. Marion Reynolds, recovering from her initial shock, began typing frantically into her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she verified Dr. Washington's credentials. The soft clicking of keys provided a subtle soundtrack to the unfolding scene. Within moments, her screen displayed Dr. Washington's impressive judicial record, complete with her official court photograph. A subtle murmur started in the gallery as recognition spread. One of the law students whispered to the other, "She wrote the majority opinion in Thompson v. State last year." The police officer who had paused in the doorway now stood rooted to the spot, his next case momentarily forgotten as he witnessed what would surely become courthouse legend. The silence in courtroom 302 had transformed from tense to excruciating. Judge Bennett's hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses, a nervous habit he thought he'd overcome years ago. His mind raced through every condescending word, every dismissive gesture he'd made in the past 20 minutes, each one now a potential career-ending mistake. Dr. Washington, he managed, his voice having lost its earlier authority. I apologize for not recognizing you sooner. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, and the slight arch of Dr. Washington's eyebrow suggested she found them equally insufficient. Marion Reynolds had pulled up Dr. Washington's complete judicial history on her screen. Head of the Judicial Ethics Committee, author of groundbreaking decisions on civil rights, guest lecturer at Harvard Law. The list scrolled on. Each achievement made Bennett's earlier treatment seem more egregious. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, its rise and fall matching the waves of anxiety watching over Bennett. The morning sun had shifted, and now the light streaming through the windows fell directly across Dr. Washington's face, highlighting her composed expression and the quiet dignity that Bennett had so completely failed to recognize. Your Honor, Dr. Washington spoke, addressing him with a courtesy he hadn't shown her. I believe we were discussing the matter of a traffic violation. Her tone was perfectly professional, yet somehow made Bennett acutely aware of every creak his chair made as he shifted uncomfortably. The law students in the gallery had abandoned any pretense of note-taking, their wide eyes darting between the two judges like spectators at a high-stakes tennis match. The elderly man with the cane had settled back in his seat, clearly planning to stay for the entire show. Even the court officer had forgotten to check his phone. transfixed by the unfolding scene. Bennett's hands moved reflexively toward his gavel, then stopped. Every routine action, every practiced gesture now seemed laden with potential mistakes. The familiar weight of his robes felt suffocating. Through his peripheral vision, he could see other court personnel gathering near the doorway, word of the situation spreading through the courthouse's efficient grapevine. Perhaps, Dr. Washington continued, lifting a document from her portfolio, we should review the actual circumstances of the stop. She paused, allowing the rustle of paper to fill the silence. I believe there are some procedural issues worth discussing, particularly regarding the calibration records of the radar equipment used. A bead of sweat rolled down Bennett's temple. In 23 years on the bench, he'd never felt so thoroughly judged. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, seeming louder than ever in the charged atmosphere. His morning coffee churned uncomfortably in his stomach as he realized this incident would likely be discussed in judicial circles for years to come. Marion Reynolds watched as her boss's complexion shifted from pale to slightly green. She'd served as his clerk long enough to recognize the signs of his mounting distress. The slight twitch in his left eye, the way his fingers drummed silently against his leg. Part of her felt sympathy for him, but a larger part remembered years of watching him deliver similarly harsh treatment to other defendants. The wall clock ticked relentlessly forward, each second stretching out like hours as the courtroom waited to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve. Dr. Washington stood patiently at the podium, her presence commanding the room without a single word. Dr. Washington opened her leather portfolio wider, revealing a meticulously organized set of documents. Your Honor, if I may draw your attention to Wisconsin Statute 346.57-4 and the recent appellate decision in State v. Rodriguez. Her voice carried the practiced ease of someone who had presided over thousands of complex cases. The law students in the gallery frantically typed on their phones, looking up the case she referenced. One whispered to the other, "That's her decision from last year about traffic stop procedures." Their excitement barely contained as they watched their textbook readings come to life. Judge Bennett nodded mechanically, though the blood still hadn't returned to his face. The morning light through the windows had shifted, casting long shadows across his bench, making him appear almost ghost-like in his black robes. Every creak of his chair seemed to emphasize his discomfort. In Rodriguez, Dr. Washington continued, we established specific guidelines regarding radar calibration requirements and the burden of proof in speed-related citations. She pulled out a precisely tabbed document. The officer's report in my case shows no documentation of calibration within the required 72-hour window. Marion Reynolds watched her boss's face as the legal framework he should have considered before rushing to judgment was methodically laid out. The clicking of her keyboard had stopped entirely. This was a lesson in judicial procedure she didn't want to miss. Through the windows, clouds shifted across the sun, creating alternating patterns of light and shadow in the courtroom. A subtle metaphor, perhaps, for the illumination being cast on proper judicial procedure. The elderly man in the gallery had leaned forward, resting both hands on his cane, clearly savoring every moment. Furthermore, Dr. Washington proceeded, her tone remaining professionally neutral. The officer's narrative suggests the stop occurred in a 25-mile-per-hour zone, while photographic evidence clearly shows 30-mile-per-hour signage. She produced time-stamped photographs that made Bennett wince at his earlier carelessness. The young court officer had pulled out his department handbook, silently comparing it to the procedures Dr. Washington was outlining. His face showed growing recognition of the gaps between proper protocol and common practice. Bennett's hands, usually steady as he wrote in his case notebook, trembled slightly as he made notes. Each point Dr. Washington raised highlighted not just the weaknesses in this case, but potential issues in hundreds of similar cases he'd handled. The implications were staggering. The Supreme Court has consistently held, Dr. Washington continued, citing cases from memory with practiced ease, that traffic enforcement must balance public safety with procedural fairness. She placed another document on the podium. This balance requires strict adherence to established protocols. The air conditioning hummed overhead, its steady drone a contrast to the irregular breathing of Judge Bennett, who looked increasingly like he wanted his chair to swallow him whole. The morning's earlier power dynamic had completely reversed, transforming the courtroom into an impromptu lecture hall on judicial best practices. Marion Reynolds had begun taking detailed notes, recognizing that Dr. Washington's impromptu lesson would likely lead to procedural changes in their courtroom. The law students had abandoned all pretense of casualness, their phones recording every word for what would undoubtedly become a legendary story in their law school's halls. Judge Bennett cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the hushed courtroom. In light of the procedural issues raised, he began, his voice having lost its earlier authoritative boom. I believe a revision of the penalty is warranted. The words seemed to physically pain him as they left his mouth. Dr. Washington stood serenely at the podium, her presence now commanding the room without effort. Your Honor, if I may? She paused, allowing Bennett a moment to nod his permission. Perhaps this presents an opportunity to discuss something more significant than a traffic citation. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. Through the tall windows, the Milwaukee skyline stood as a silent witness to this moment of judicial reckoning. The two law students had stopped typing, their fingers hovering over their phones as they held their breath. Every person who enters a courtroom, Dr. Washington continued, her voice carrying years of carefully considered wisdom, deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status. She gestured subtly to the gallery, where the elderly man nodded in silent agreement. Marion Reynolds watched her boss's face flush deeper as the gentle rebuke landed. In all her years as his clerk, she'd never seen him so thoroughly stripped of his usual pompous demeanor. The transformation was as fascinating as it was necessary. I've spent much of my career, Dr. Washington went on, working to ensure our judicial system lives up to its promise of equal justice under law. She placed her hand flat on the podium, the simple gold band on her finger catching the light. That promise begins in courtrooms like this one, with everyday interactions. The young court officer had pulled out a small notebook, jotting down notes with unusual intensity. Even the police officer waiting by the door had moved closer, drawn into the impromptu masterclass in judicial ethics and human dignity. Bennett's hands fidgeted with his glasses, a nervous habit he displayed increasingly throughout the proceeding. Dr. Washington, he managed, his voice barely carrying across the courtroom. Your point is well taken. I apologize for my assumptions and conduct. The air conditioning cycled off, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Dr. Washington allowed the moment to stretch, letting the weight of the situation settle fully on everyone present. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking each second of this transformative moment. Your Honor, she finally responded, her tone professional but tinged with purpose. Perhaps we could discuss implementing some procedural reforms that would help ensure equal treatment for all who appear before this court. She gestured to her portfolio where several other documents waited. I have some suggestions based on successful programs in other jurisdictions. Bennett nodded, the motion almost eager in its intensity, like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. The gallery had grown fuller as word spread through the courthouse, with several attorneys and court staff finding reasons to observe the proceedings. Each person seemed to sense they were witnessing something significant. Marion Reynolds began preparing a new case file, labeling it Procedural Reforms with careful strokes. She'd seen enough to know that today would mark a turning point in how their courtroom operated. The familiar sounds of the courthouse, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, creaking chairs, seemed to carry a different weight now. In the weeks that followed, Courtroom 302 underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The physical space remained unchanged. The same oak benches, the same towering windows, the same ancient radiators that clanked in the winter months. But the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Judge Bennett had requested a temporary reassignment from traffic court to allow time for comprehensive judicial retraining. His office, once decorated with certificates and awards, now displayed a framed copy of the Equal Justice Under Law Manifesto. The afternoon sun still streamed through his window, but it fell across a desk now covered with ethics training materials and judicial conduct guidelines. Word of the encounter spread through Milwaukee's legal community like wildfire. In courthouse break rooms and law firm lounges, the story grew into something of a legend. The law students who witnessed it had posted detailed accounts on their school's legal forum, sparking intense discussions about judicial conduct and implicit bias. Marion Reynolds noticed the changes most clearly. Where Bennett had once rushed through his morning docket with barely a glance at the defendants, he now took time to listen, to consider, to weigh his words carefully. The transformation wasn't perfect. Old habits died hard, but the effort was visible in every case he handled. Dr. Washington's traffic citation was ultimately dismissed on procedural grounds, but her impact resonated far beyond that single case. She had turned what could have been a moment of personal vindication into an opportunity for systemic change. The Milwaukee County court system implemented mandatory quarterly training sessions on bias recognition and equitable treatment, with Bennett's case serving as an anonymous case study. The elderly man who had witnessed the encounter became a regular presence in the courthouse, volunteering with a community advocacy group that helped defendants navigate the judicial system. Sometimes, when asked why he chose to spend his retirement this way, he would smile and say, "I saw justice work once in a way I'll never forget." The young court officer who had been present that day rose through the ranks, eventually becoming a training coordinator for new officers. He made sure every rookie understood that authority without respect was no authority at all. His training sessions often began with the story of that morning, though he was careful to protect the identities of those involved. 3 months after the incident, Judge Bennett received an invitation to speak at a judicial conference about transformative moments in legal careers. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, recognizing Dr. Washington's name among the organizers. The topic assigned to him: the role of humility in judicial practice. The Milwaukee courthouse itself seemed different somehow. Perhaps it was the new training programs, or the revised procedural guidelines, or simply the lingering echo of that morning's lessons. But defendants who entered courtroom 302 now found themselves treated with a baseline of dignity that had too often been missing before. As for Dr. Washington, she continued her work on the federal bench, writing opinions that shaped law across multiple states. She never mentioned the incident in public, but occasionally, when speaking to young law students about the importance of judicial temperament, she would share a subtle smile and note that sometimes the most powerful lessons about justice come from unexpected moments. The final paragraph of her next published opinion included a line that those who knew the story recognized immediately. Justice is not merely about the application of law, but about the recognition of human dignity in every interaction within our courts.